I thought that this morning I would tell you about my own personal experiences in the Second World War, but also try to give you some context from that war. And I'll talk for a while and then invite your questions and anything you want to ask me personally or internationally would be okay. I'm going to try to talk without a microphone. If you can hear me all right, can you all the way there?
Yes.
Some of you may sympathize with me when I tell you that I have hay fever, and sometimes in the spring when pollen is in the air, my throat can get clogged up a little bit. So if my voice disappears, I'll try to give me some strength from water and do the best I can. I want to begin by saying something that I remember very vividly. On the morning when I left my hometown to go to Wake Forest as a freshman in 1939, a long time ago, the headline in the morning newspaper that day was that Germany had invaded Poland. When I left my own house that morning and picked up the paper, I saw the beginning of World War II that very day. So I went to Wake Forest knowing that my 4 years at Wake Forest would be affected in some ways I didn't know how by the Second World War. So from the time I went to Wake Forest, I wondered how long I would stay in school and how long my classmates would be in school. The United States had already begun to prepare for the likelihood that we would eventually be in the war. Because of our experience in the First World War, the United States was reluctant to commit itself to the side of the Allies, even though our sympathies were clearly with the Allies. There was still a good bit of isolationist sentiment in the United States, and there were men in prominence who did not think America should go to war. And yet we could see day by day that we were really on the way to war. The president, Franklin Roosevelt, clearly thought that war would come, and he began to take measures with the help of Congress to prepare for America's being in the war. Most important, we instituted the Selective Service system, which would draft American men who were physically fit to go into service. And so beginning in my freshman, sophomore years, people I knew began to be drafted and sent somewhere to an Army camp. That was beginning to happen. We also had the unparalleled opportunity by radio to hear Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England. England, of course, had always been, to a certain extent, and that's true today, our most important ally. And so there was much bonding between America and England and between Roosevelt and Churchill. So listening to Roosevelt, listening to Churchill, we knew that things that were very significant for us were going to happen. I had in my room at Wake Forest, and this was, I guess you know, on the old campus, not this campus, a much plainer campus, by the way. I had in my room a big map of Europe. And day by day, I traced on the map the movement of the armies on both sides in Europe. I was less concerned about the war in the East at that time, although perhaps because I went there, I should have been. But my roommate and I and my friends would watch what was happening as the Nazis gradually conquered Europe country by country, coming on, most importantly, to the fall of France. So we watched the war, we listened, we learned. You know, there was no television then, so radio was our means of communication along with the newspaper. And then in my junior year, in December of my junior year, 1941, I was working in my room one day when I heard heavy shoes coming up the steps. I was upstairs. And a friend of mine named Bob Lyde, I still remember his name, burst into the room and said, "The Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor." December 7th, 1941. So we knew then for certain that America was in the war and that things would begin to happen very quickly. Some of my friends and classmates had already been drafted into the Army, and almost every week or so, you would hear about somebody who had gone into the military. Kerry King sent me some pages from a howler, which told me, and I'd forgotten, that 85 Wake Forest men died in World War II. That is a lot for a small college. You know, we had not many more than 1,000 students at that time. I had two older brothers who had been drafted by the time Pearl Harbor came. One went into the infantry and was later sent to Europe and fought in some of the major battles in Europe and spent a good deal of time in a hospital in Paris. The other brother went into the 82nd Airborne Division and fought most significantly in a famous and bloody battle called the Battle of the Bulge, one of the worst battles in Europe in World War II. So I knew from my brothers what might lie ahead. Fortunately, I was still very young. And when I entered into my senior year, I was only 20. But I knew that ahead of me would be the necessity of somehow serving in the war. I had heard from my brothers what it was like to be in the Army, and I thought something more appealing might lie ahead for me. And I did a very impulsive and spontaneous thing. I tend to be rather romantic temperamentally anyway. So one morning in my senior year, I decided that I really didn't want to be drafted into the Army, that I would like to go into the Navy. And that was impulsive. I had never been on a ship. I hadn't even been on a boat. I'd never seen the ocean except the beach at North Carolina. I was not a good swimmer. So why was I going into the Navy? I think I was going into the Navy because all my life I had read books about the sea. From the time I was just a little boy and read Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, I was haunted by stories about the sea. And when I was a teenager, I read some books by a fellow that's forgotten now named Howard Pease, who wrote books for boys about the sea. The Ship Without a Crew, The Tattooed Man, And then I made my way into Joseph Conrad and all those novels. So I was a reader, I was a romantic, and in spite of the fact that it seemed not to fit my personality at all, I decided that really I wanted to go into the Navy rather than be drafted into the Army. And this is a true story. One morning in my senior year, I think it was January, I woke up one morning and I said to myself, I'm not even going to wait. I went and got the bus from Old Wake Forest. The Old Wake Forest is about 16 miles from Raleigh. I got up and went and took the bus, went into Raleigh, went into the Naval Recruiting Station, and said, I want to join the Naval Reserve. I had my physical, which I passed, and whatever mental there was, which I passed. No problem there because I'd gone to Wake Forest. And so I signed up for the Naval Reserve. I was already a senior, so the Navy allowed me to remain in school, and this would have been true for other people. They allowed me to remain in school and graduate. So I did graduate in the spring of 1943, a long time ago. The Navy at that time had 3 universities that had midshipman schools: Columbia, Notre Dame, and Northwestern. So I knew that when I started my naval career, I would go to one of those universities. And they sent me to Northwestern. Anybody here from Chicago? So I went to Northwestern for what is called midshipman school. I hope these terms are fairly familiar to you. But the midshipman school at that time was a program of about 4 months that prepared you for naval service and prepare you to become a naval officer. That was the other advantage of going into the Naval Reserve. I would be an officer rather than an enlisted man. So I was sent to Northwestern, and I became what was jokingly called a 90-day wonder, which meant that you got commissioned in 90 days. I will tell you that the midshipman training program was extremely intense because so much had to be done so quickly to get young men ready for service. We had 4 classes every day. Each class was 2 hours. So we got up in the morning and had breakfast and went to a 2-hour class at 8 o'clock. This was a class in navigation where we learned as best we could how to stand on the bridge of a ship and be responsible for navigating the ship. We learned the sky, which stars to take our sextant and observe. We worked what is called a maneuvering board, and we learned as best we could, very intense, as you can imagine, we learned navigation. Then from 8 to 10, we went to a gunnery class and learned. I'd never held a gun in my hand before, and haven't since I left the Navy, actually. But we had to learn how to carry a gun and use it if we had to. And we also had to learn how to load the big guns on board a ship, which would send out barrages to the islands who were going to have to come near. Took a break for lunch. From 1 to 3, we went to a seamanship class, where we learned to tie knots. We learned about the ship's engines. We learned about everything which was below the main deck. In short, we learned something about the ship. That was from 1 to 3. And then from 3 to 5, we had physical drills. We ran, we swam, we went through obstacle courses. It was intense, but so much had to be done so quickly. And all of the boys, young men in my group were, like me, some of them much more athletic than I was, but we were all in our early 20s somewhere. After 4 months, we were graduated and we were commissioned. I became an ensign in the Navy, which is the lowest rank for an officer, you perhaps know. Before I left Northwestern, I had an interview, and a superior officer said to me, "Now that you have your commission, what would you like to do? Where would you like to go? What kind of ship would you like to serve on?" Well, I knew I didn't want to go on a submarine, and I thought that a battleship or a cruiser was too large. So I said, well, I'd like to go on a destroyer, a mid-size naval vessel. What would you like to do? I said, well, I think maybe I'd like to be a communications officer. I was an English major, you see, so it made sense to be in communications. I'd like to be a communications officer. So he listened to me. I didn't know what would happen. But a few weeks later, I got an order to go to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is the Navy Yard outside New York City. And I was ordered to report to the USS Kaufman as an assistant communications officer. It was a destroyer. It was not a destroyer, it was a destroyer escort. We had aircraft carriers and we had escort carriers. We had destroyers and we had destroyer escorts. I'll tell you more about that later. So I was assigned to a destroyer escort as a brand new, absolutely inexperienced 20-year-old ensign to be the assistant communications officer. The ship in the Brooklyn Navy Yard was just being built. When you study World War II, one thing that can excite you and amaze you was the way in which the United States got ready for the war. Building ships, planes, tanks, drafting men and women so quickly and so powerfully. The arsenal of democracy, Roosevelt said. So I was sent to this ship, which was just being built and finished. When the ship was finished, we had what was called a Shakedown Cruise. The purpose of the Shakedown Cruise was to discover if the new ship was ready for battle, if all the parts were working, if there were no kinks in the machinery. We'd go on a Shakedown Cruise and test the ship. So we were sent on a Shakedown Cruise to Bermuda. Not a bad place to go. So we sailed down the East Coast to Bermuda, had 1 or 2 delightful days in Bermuda, by the way, and then came back to Boston and got the word that the Shakedown Cruise had been satisfactory and the ship was ready for battle. But then I got another order which said that since I'd had some experience on the Kaufman as an assistant communications officer, I was being transferred to another ship that was being built, this time in the Charleston Navy Yard in Boston. So I was transferred to Boston to another new ship where I was to be the communications officer. I had my 6 weeks training, so I was ready now to be the communications officer. So then I went to Boston for another ship, and then we went on another Shakedown Cruise, this time to Key West, where we, you know, there's some good things to be said about the Navy, really. Went down to Key West and we tried to learn what we had to do. Let me say briefly that a communications officer on board a ship is responsible for all outgoing and all incoming communications. Radio would be the main device. There are radio men, enlisted men on board the ship who sit at the keyboard taking and sending radio messages all the time, just the way you do it with your computers. Signals, the signal men, the people who ran up the signal flags on the mast. Semaphores, all communications come under the communications officer. The main responsibility I had, which could not be given to an enlisted man, was that I was responsible for all encoding and decoding messages. We had very primitive coding machines, and the coding machines were locked in a closet. And we would get a coded message, maybe telling the captain of the ship where the ship was going next, or whatever it might be. And it was my responsibility to decode the message as best I could and take it to the captain of the ship. So that's what a communications officer did. In addition to being a communications officer, every officer had to stand watch 8 of the 24 hours. Your watch responsibility was to be the officer on the bridge. And the watches were from 12 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 12, and so on through 24 hours. So what you did was to stand watch for a 4-hour period. And if you were unlucky, it might be from midnight to 4 o'clock. And then in the other 8 hours, you rested, slept, ate, and did the particular things that you were responsible for, in my case, communications. So that was the task that was given to us folks. By the way, almost everybody on board my ship was young. A 35 or 40-year-old person would be an anomaly on a ship like this, because we had all, like me, just joined up. The other thing I'll mention to you, and I hope this is not too arcane here, but a destroyer escort has the primary function of protecting a carrier from submarine attack. Typically, for example, a carrier might go into battle and there would be 6 destroyer escorts coming from midship on this side to midships on the other side. So that as the carrier went into battle and launched airplanes from its deck to go to a land target, the destroyer escort would be constantly on the alert lest there be submarines in the water near where the carrier was. We, of course, did not want the carrier to be hit. So After I left Boston and went down to Key West, we went to a training school where we learned to drop depth charges. That was one of the things that a destroyer escort could do. I'll give you an illustration because most people probably aren't aware of this particular kind of training. We would go out on the DE, the destroyer escort, in the morning to a place in the waters near Key West where there was what we would call a tame submarine. A tame submarine being an American submarine. We would use our sonar equipment, the sounding equipment for going under the waters. We would use our sonar equipment to determine whether there was a submarine out there. And eventually we would discover that there was a submarine out there, a friendly submarine. We would then try to use our instincts to determine when we should drop a depth charge to hit that submarine. And it was the call of the officer on duty to decide when to drop the depth charge, which would blow up a submarine. However, you didn't drop a depth charge. You dropped dye of some color in the water, red, orange, some color. So the dye would go into the water where presumably, if it had been an enemy sub, the depth charge would have gone. Then the tame submarine under the water would send up a dye from below. If the dye from below came to the same place as the dye from above, you had a perfect hit. And you got an A. Because that meant that your decision to drop the depth charge was correct. Anyway, that's what we did. Seems so far away, doesn't it, from English literature? But then, by that time, we'd had the Shakedown Cruise, we'd had the anti-submarine warfare experience. We were ready to go to the Pacific. So we left Key West, went through the Caribbean, went through the Panama Canal, went to San Francisco, went to Pearl Harbor, and then began visiting islands that had already been conquered by the Americans. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Guam, Tinian, Saipan. These names mean nothing to you, but they were way stops on the way to Ulithi. You probably have never heard of Ulithi. Has anyone ever heard of Ulithi? Probably not. It was famous then. Ulithi is an atoll, which means that it is a round island like a circle with land that goes all the way around and with a lagoon in the middle. The Ulithi Lagoon was large enough to accommodate the entire Pacific Fleet. So we were sent to Ulithi to join the Pacific Fleet. Soon after that, we got our first important orders. We were sent to participate in the invasion of Iwo Jima. And what that meant was that we would leave Ulithi as a team of destroyers, and we would move toward the island of Iwo Jima. You probably know Iwo Jima from John Wayne or Clint Eastwood or somebody. A very important moment in World War II history. Then we would be off the island protecting the carriers as the carriers sent airplanes to the island to bomb the enemy. We were close enough to see what was going on. The rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, you know that. We could see that. And on occasion, we could see, I have one vivid memory, almost terrifying memory in some ways. I saw a kamikaze pilot, which is a suicidal pilot bent on destruction. I saw a kamikaze pilot take his plane all the way to a ship that I could see, land into the ship and blew it up. But fortunately, we on our ship never were hit. And we got through Iwo Jima okay. I had a chance to go ashore, by the way, to pick up the mail. That's one of the advantages you have in communications. Then we went back to Ulithi. Then, not long after that, we got word that we were next going to go to Okinawa. And so again, we sailed for Okinawa and had the same experience. Planes going in, destroy escorts helping out. We did not encounter, by the way, I never encountered an enemy submarine anywhere, it turned out. So we went through the Okinawa invasion and then came back to Ulithi. I remember that, I think it was in July of 1945, we received on board ship instructions for the next operation. And the next operation was going to be the invasion of Japan. Because it was believed at that time that we had made our way across the Pacific, that the next thing would have to be to invade the Japanese homeland. It is hard to imagine what that would have been like, having gone to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It's impossible to believe that. But we were beginning to get indications of when it would take place and how it would take place. And then, you know the story, soon after that, we received word by radio that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, and then the atomic bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki, and that the Japanese had surrendered. So there would not be an invasion of Japan. The documents were signed on the USS Missouri, the battleship Missouri, by General Douglas MacArthur, and the war was over. So in September of 1945, World War II came to an end. You know that the European war had ended sometime before. Well, we remained in the Pacific for two or 3 months more, because there were so many ships, so many people that had to be taken back to the States. But then about December of 1945, we got orders to proceed to San Francisco. We made our way across the Pacific Ocean, had a delightful few days in Hawaii, had a chance to explore the islands, go up to that beautiful Pali Pass, go to Waikiki Beach. Things were beginning to be a little easier now. And then we made our way to San Francisco. And I still have a vision of coming under the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco. That's coming home. After a while in San Francisco, we were sent first to Long Beach, which is near Los Angeles, and then down to San Diego. And in San Diego, the ship, which never sailed again, by the way, the ship I was on, some of the DEs were kept as sort of historic items. But most of the ships, like the one I was on, were put in what is called mothballs. That means they were put aside, not sent to sea, but kept in case there should be another need for them. So we were sent down to San Diego, and watched as the ship was put into mothballs. And then we began to get word that people were going to be discharged. The order of discharge took place on the basis of certain facts. If you were older, if you were married, if you had children, you got more points. And I was young, unmarried, with no children. So I was the last officer on board my ship, the last officer to be sent home. And I will tell you one odd little thing, which has always amused me, given my background. Since I was the last officer left on board the ship, for about a month, I became the captain of the ship. The ship was in the dock, it never went anywhere. And I just sat there and enjoyed the captain's cabin and that sort of thing. But I had that 1 month of glory. And then in June of 1946, I came home to my hometown. And just one final comment. I've been very personal about this, and other people who have been through World War II would tell you a different story. I got home wondering what on earth I was going to do in 1946. I had a call at my home from the chairman of the English department at Wake Forest, Dr. Rodas Jones, and he called me and he said, "We have so many more students this fall than we had expected because there are so many veterans coming back. I wonder if you would like to come back to Wake Forest and teach for a year." I didn't take long to answer. I didn't have a job. I was not going to stay in the Navy. And I said, I'd love to. So I came back to Wake Forest to teach. And except for graduate school, I've been here ever since. So somehow I guess that's my story. And I'd be glad to, I hope I haven't been too personal, but I wanted you to see it from the perspective of somebody your age. I think as you sit there in your teens and 20s, and I stand here from long ago, I think to be able to perceive in somebody else not what he is now, but what he was, is very important. Because what he was to be like you years ago. Well, I'll be glad to take questions. Thank you. Thank you. Or if not, I'll be glad to slip out.
You guys have any questions?
What exactly did you do during your months as captain, so to speak?
Very little. One thing that happened that has always amused me, I understood communications, but I was not very good at the details of ship life, especially. I didn't know that much about anchors and all that. For some reason that I never will understand, everything was very smooth. Anybody from California? I will tell you that the 6 months we were in California, things began to be very relaxed. And we had some few duties, but the war was over. We had every weekend from Friday to Monday off. And 2 or 3 other officers and I would explore California. And California to me was like a fairyland. It probably still is. But California in the 1940s, before the freeways and the interstates, and before all the smog and the crowding, We would go to Palm Springs, to Yosemite, to the Redwood Forest, to Tijuana, almost any place, and had such a great time. I loved California at that time. And San Diego is a great city, I think. Where are you from?
San Francisco.
Oh, well, I like Los Angeles too. Do you know where Long Beach is? Yeah. Well, we went up to Santa Catalina, I remember one time, which is the island off the coast there. Well, so mainly we had a good time, really a good time. One day, I was there on the ship, and this rather grizzled Navy veteran type came to the ship and he said, I want us to conduct a fire and rescue drill on the ship today. And he had some men with him. It was a kind of test, a kind of investigation. We'd like to have a fire and rescue drill. Now, and I said inside, how do I go about having a fire and rescue drill? I've never seen one. A fire and rescue drill, you know, would be in case the ship got on fire, you would come in and rescue the people from the fire. What to do? I called the chief petty officer. You know, enlisted men knew a lot more about the ship than we did. I called the chief petty officer, Chief Bialois, and I said to Chief Bialois, do you know how to have a fire and rescue drill? And he said, I think I can put it together. So the chief scooted around the ship and got all the other sailors and other people. And then I came back to the deck and I said to the naval officer, we're ready for the fire and rescue drill. I hadn't done anything, but it had been done. So the chief and all these enlisted men took the visitors all around the ship and showed them how ready we were for a fire and rescue drill and what we would do. So they came back to the deck, and I'm proud of the fact that he said to me, I'm so impressed. That is one of the best fire and rescue drills I have ever seen. I hope that's recorded somewhere in my naval papers in Washington. But that's the only thing that ever happened. Mainly I had a good time. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I don't hear very well at the distance.
Could you walk us through your thought process when you, for example, the story you told about the Kamikaze hitting a nearby plane? I mean, it's hard for some of us as 20, 21-year-olds or 19-year-olds who have never experienced something like that.
Right.
You know, we enjoy so much privilege in our lives, but what were you thinking as you saw a life and death situation? How did you reconcile that? How do you reflect on it now? That's something very hard for me to imagine happening to me today.
Well, one thing I would say is that it's easier to experience if you are 20 or 21. Have you ever read a wonderful essay? I'm going back to English literature now. A wonderful essay by William Hazlitt. Probably haven't read it. It's called On the Feeling of Immortality in Youth. I think I felt that way as a young person, that I was immortal. Do you understand what I mean? You don't think about death. You think that your life is ahead of you and you're going to live it, and you do the best you can with it. So I think I had the feeling, if I recall, a feeling of great sadness at what was happening to other people, but a feeling of great joy that it was not happening to us. It's taking chances. It's diving into the ocean, even if you don't like to swim, because somehow you think, you think you can manage it somehow. One of the scariest experiences I ever had myself, and I shudder when I think about it because it was scary. The destroyer escort would sometimes have to side up next to a tanker and get gas. A big tanker would be there in the bay, and we would move to get up next to the tanker and throw over our lines and our cables so that the gas could be transferred by the line to our ship. One time I remember that we were next to the ship, and we were here and the ship was here. And you went from this ship to that ship on a rope ladder, which was fairly easy to manage. You would come up to the deck of your ship, climb up the rope ladder to the tanker, and then presumably climb back down. This is a strange little thing, but it haunts me a little bit. I went up the rope ladder to the tanker and watched the procedure that was taking place, and the tanker sent the supplies over to the Escort. By the time that it finished, our ship, because of the water changing, had risen up here to be at the same level as the tanker, which meant that the rope ladder, instead of going up and down, was like this. So you had to get on the rope ladder, flat down on your stomach, holding on to each rung, and make your way as best you could, which, because the rope ladder was very soft and bendable, required some great care. Am I describing what that would have been like? And to go on your stomach down a rope ladder over 4 or 5 feet of ocean below that's one of my most painful memories. And I say to myself, how could I have done it? Well, I don't know how. You just sort of do it. But I agree with you that it's not that you steel yourself. It's a sense that somehow this is life is. I'm young. I'm healthy. I can cope with it. I think you must feel that way all the time. Yeah. You can't be scared. And by the way, you can't be scared of life. Really. And live life the way it needs to be lived. But, excuse me. I'm being far too reminiscent here. Karen?
I'll ask a question if you don't mind. You mentioned going ashore once to pick up the mail.
Yeah.
Did you receive many letters when you were at sea? Did you send many letters?
Well, I received probably more than I sent, because my mother was a very faithful, concerned letter writer. Yeah. We would go ashore. I mentioned those various islands. We would leave the ship and get on a whaleboat and go into the island, because typically the ship could not moor at the island itself. The ship had to moor out in the bay. So you'd go on a little boat, and there would be on the island, on every island, there would be a post office where you could mail letters and where you could receive letters. Because sometimes we were at sea for weeks, so there were many blocks of time when we didn't hear anything. And I would even sometimes get a box of cookies or something like that.
Do you recall what you would write back home about?
Well, never about operations. You would write about things that you were doing in your personal life. Clearly, you couldn't talk about. In fact, you couldn't even say, "I'm in Ulithi." Your actual location was unknown to your family. And by the way, one of the functions of an officer on board the ship, the Navy was and perhaps still is a little more class conscious, if I can put it that way, than the Army. But one of my functions as an officer was to read the letters of enlisted men. An enlisted man's letter had to be read by an officer and stamped for approval, so that if anything was in the letter that would reveal anything that the enemy ought not to know, you cut it out. Hardly ever happened, but once in a while, really. So that many letters that you would see from World War II Navy people would be somehow not intact, if I can put it that way. Yes, sir.
Did you keep the letters that you received, like from your mother, whoever else sent you letters while you were serving time? Did you keep those letters? Like, do you still have those letters today?
Yes, I still have the letters. I haven't looked at them in a long time, but I still have them. I think she kept some of mine. I'm not sure. There wouldn't have been that many. My brothers who were in the Army were in a position. They were in. Compared to them, I had life so easy, truly so easy, because they suffered a great deal. On the other hand, they could get letters off because they were on the ground in Europe. And I think many of their letters were kept by their families. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Yeah.
When you took the ships out on the trial runs, where was your favorite place to go? I mean, you said you explored all the different islands and everything.
Beg pardon?
When you took the ships out on their first runs after they were built, where was your favorite place you went?
Oh, those shakedown cruises. I think Bermuda. Anybody been to Bermuda? I think it's just a wonderful, beautiful place. And that it was so nice because we could go to restaurants, for example. We would get bicycles and ride around the island. And it was so safe and pretty. I like Key West. Key West was at that time, a much more naval military kind of place than maybe it is now. I understand it's a very popular vacation place now, but years ago it was not so much that way. One of the most beautiful places we ever went was to Guam. By that time, Guam was fully in American hands. And I might say that I went to the Pacific at a much better time when I did, because by the time I went there, much of the submarine menace of the Japanese had been eliminated. Have you ever seen a movie called The Battle of Midway? It's a wonderful movie to see. But on Guam, we had a chance to go to this beautiful beach and swim and rest and so on. That was nice. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, how did you feel about the act of writing the soldiers' letters? Did it make you sad? Did it make you happy? Were they mostly sad or were they mostly?
I hated doing it. I had to, but I hated doing it. The main thing that I hated was reading love letters, because many of the letters that I read were letters sent by the young men on ship to their girlfriends or their wives. And many of the letters were love letters. And they were beautiful and loving and kind. And I felt as if I was invading that person's privacy. What I did was to block off the name of the writer so that I could read the letter without knowing who wrote it. Because I didn't want the next morning to see some enlisted friend of mine who might know that I had entered into his private life. So you had to watch things like that. You know. Yes.
I was going to ask, have your experiences in World War II shaped the way you think military wars anyway? Or,
They probably have, yes. One difference is, all of you know, I think most of us who were students at the time of World War II, including me, had no problem with being patriotic. I think because we felt that, this has often been said, that World War II was to a certain extent a just war, in that the enemy was clearly an enemy that had to be defeated. I think America could not stand by and see Germany take Europe, particularly given what we learned about the Holocaust, and then have Germany invade and take England. I knew only one person in college who was a conscientious objector, to the point at which he would not accept military service, but was instead permitted by the government to work in some kind of non-combatant place in America. But I think most of us felt that this was a war that, for the sake of mankind, had to be fought. I have had a lot of, I will tell you myself, that I've had much more ambiguity about the wars we have fought since then. On a personal level, I will just admit I was opposed to the war in Vietnam. And I was also opposed to the war in Iraq. And that comes about in part because I think sometimes if you've seen war or you've seen enough of war, you realize that somehow sending people to die in a cause which is not correct or just is a dangerous thing for a country to do. So I am both a patriot, but I'm also of the feeling that war should never be entered upon except with great clarity about your objectives. I feel that way, for example, about what's going on in Ukraine right now. I spent 2 weeks in Ukraine last summer on a very happy trip because I wanted to see Ukraine. I can't believe what's happening there now. But what do we do about it? What do we do? And it remains to be seen what we're going to do. I think we're not going to send soldiers. So I think you're left with a burden of anxiety about war. Does that make sense to you? Not because of the men and women who fought there, but because of the conditions that made it necessary for them to fight there.
So do you feel that your patriotism is a little more nuanced?
I have to come back.
Would you say that your patriotism is much more nuanced having served in the war?
I think so. I do. Yeah, I think. You become more aware of it. As you get older, you become, I spoke earlier about the feeling of immortality in youth. As you get older, you become more aware of mortality. That may be a kind of prosaic statement, but I think it's true.
So guys, let's give him a round of applause.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much for talking to the class.
Oh, you're
Thank
welcome,
you
Dr.
for your
Rainer.
service.
Good to meet
Thank
you.
Nice to meet you too.
Such a good group to talk to, really.
Pretty
Good
right?
class.
So you guys, if you have a few minutes, please come up.